Welcome to the final presentation where we've been looking at this strange book in the Old Testament, the Song of Songs. I'm going to try and draw together the main threads of insights that this book can bring to us today. The book is a celebration of sexual love. The language says it. The structure says it. It's a set of erotic love poems of a wonderful part of human existence. You could summarize it that way. The book is a message of the meaning of sexual love in God's plan. It's part of life for most people, and it's conveyed in the exchanges and experiences of an imaginary couple and their friends. All the evidence points that way. So it's centered on sexual love and intimacy. This is a wonderful gift that God has given to humanity. Now, I recognize that there are some who for various reasons have chosen not to enter sexual love and intimacy and live a life in a different way. That's fine. But for the vast majority, this is God's gift to humanity. And sexual fulfillment is part of living. It involves our bodies, our minds, our emotions, and they come together, and there is great pleasure. God made us that way. And pleasure is not a bad thing. In these poems, she describes his body in detail, and she revels in his sexuality. He is a sexual being. But equally, he describes her body in detail, and he revels in her intimate parts. Both are sexual beings. And when they come together in sexual intimacy, there is total vulnerability. Part of being human, but also total trust. There is a complete freedom when sexual intimacy takes place in total commitment and marriage. And that leads to enormous joy, and the joy is in giving pleasure to the other. That's God's design. That's the way He made us. And when we run away from it and pretend it's not there, we lose out on God's plan. And we lose out on this part of living. God gave us bodies. Our bodies are not bad with our personality and our spirits being good. Everything is all integrated together to make us who we are. Your body, your personality, your spirit, that makes you the you that you are. And you can't dissect them and pull them apart. We're completely integrated in this way. Yes, our bodies allow us to move, to live, to do things. We're not disembodied spirits. And because we can do things for the benefit of other people. And indeed, it's possible to say that our purpose in living is to bring benefit to those around us. And that is the true meaning of love. But within the marriage relationship, our bodies are there to give pleasure to our life partner. The book pictures God's ideal. It isn't always there for everybody, for life circumstances sometimes mean that we don't have a life partner. God can compensate for us in many other ways for that. But this is God's ideal for the majority. And what a beautiful picture it is. It stresses that each of us have been given a body. You have been given a body. God made you the way you are, and He did not make a mistake. Your body is not impure. It is not evil. It's part of the you that's you. You've only got one body. Look after it. Respect it. But never regard it as impure and evil. And the only thing that's worth considering is your soul and your spirit. That goes back to ancient Greek philosophy, and it is simply not biblical. And when we suppress the natural needs of our body, then we miss out on life. We need food, we need water and drink, and sex is part of being a human being. And when it is suppressed and suppressions imposed upon us, then it distorts our lives in some way. That is true, and we have to face up to the truth of that. Pleasure, that's not exploiting another person, but pleasure in sexual intimacy in an atmosphere of vulnerability and commitment. Yes, we're animals, but we don't just run on the way of instinct. It's not just an expression of male instinct. It's far, far more than that. There's a mutuality in it, and this amazing set of poems demonstrates that mutuality, and by choosing to present the ideas through the voice mainly of the woman, it is totally subversive and countercultural in those days when men had all the power. There is mutual bonding and unity, and pleasure is part of that. But it brings freedom, brings fulfilment, and it brings vulnerability. A beautiful picture that the book brings to us. Now, if that is all the case, what we have to do is to learn how to give maximum pleasure to each other. We have to learn how to look after each other. We have to learn in life in a broader sense and putting the agendas of others before our own selfish agendas. That is the true meaning of biblical love. Sexual love is a different word in the language, but the same principles apply. From the man's perspective, it's tough and it's hard, learning not to make selfish demands. From the woman's perspective, learning not to restrict her body in any way. Yes, I'll sleep with you tonight, provided that. No conditions. Total vulnerability, total freedom, total fulfillment, mutuality. And it means that we have to learn. And we will make mistakes. And we have to learn to allow for the mistakes of the other. And then move forward. It starts with love and attraction. And that can be both ways. That involves all the senses. For the man, it's so often what he sees. For the woman, it is so often the nature and character of the man she sees. But it involves all the senses coming together, and it leads to a desire to get to know each other. A desire to be together. Again, all the senses are involved. And as time goes on, there is a desire to touch growing. That leads forward to a desire for intimacy and sexual fulfillment. This is the way God made us. This is a complete fulfillment arising from attraction, leading to commitment and love. But commitment is so important, lifelong commitment. And it's totally exclusive. We saw that little phrase, unyielding jealousy. We will not allow others to hurt our loved one, to get in the way, to share it. And we will not share our sexual interests with others. That is a picture that's presented in this book. But 3 times in the book there is a warning spoken by the woman, and spoken by the woman to younger women. Do not seek to arouse this kind of demanding love, which means total commitment, until the right moment. The comment is that sexual love is not a passing emotion. Sexual love is a demanding and exhausting relationship. We'll return to that in a moment or two. That's what it is in God's plan. Take it away from total commitment, we've lost out in some way. Take it away from total trust, where someone is exploiting or using another, we've lost out in some way. Take it away from the true meaning of love, which seeks the best for the other, we've lost out in some way. And in one of the poems, hesitation on her part starts to undermine the true meaning of intimacy. Intimacy involves vulnerability and a total giving. And when that total commitment and total giving, total vulnerability is consummated, love consumes her. And it consumes him too, but it's spoken from her perspective. And one of the pictures that these poems give is the total freedom in lovemaking, the total freedom in pleasure. God delights in our pleasure. He made us that way. But we have to give to each other in total commitment to find the true meaning of that total freedom. And that's why it all works out. And we're looking to see what this book can direct us to get at the true meaning, which is so desperately needed in our society today. I could summarize it that way. Sexual fulfillment is expressed in a permanent relationship of commitment, one to the other. Fall away from that picture, we fall away from God's ideal. God wants the best for us. And is pictured here in these poems, a picture of the best in this area of sexual fulfillment and intimacy, and given us a framework which can guide us so we can seek and move towards his best. Now let's move on. You can summarize some of this way. It starts with mutual attraction. Now it has to be mutual if it's going to enter into the total depth of the reality of God's plan. You can't leave it to what the man wants by physical attraction and the woman's just got to comply. That happens in some cultures and religions, but it loses out in part. There's a magnetism that pulls the couple together. They just want to be together. They want to share things. They want to talk together on their own. That's part of God's plan. But there has to be, from the man's perspective, total respect for the woman. Too often in our media presentations, men see women as possessions. And indeed, in some religious traditions, that still sadly remains today, at least in part. Total respect for the woman. She is not a sex object. She was not made just for our pleasure, for us to do with what we want to and then to throw it out when it suits us. But from the woman's perspective, and this is a clear message to women which the woman in the story of these poems emphasizes again and again. The power of a woman's body to arouse a man. Be cautious. That doesn't mean to say that we have to dress up a woman in robes and a veil. That's imposing something on them. And again, these poems show that's not the ideal way. But be cautious in how you dress and how you behave, what you do and what you say. Some of the poems emphasize and celebrate the chastity before marriage. The next poem celebrates monogamy within marriage. Many of the poems celebrate the joy of sexual intimacy. But that is set in a position of total commitment. That's why chastity before and monogamy within are so important. Because it allows total commitment to come so much more fully. It all makes a cohesive, sensible package, the best that God has for us. But we've got to remember that the culture of today in the West is very, very different from the culture at the times when this book may have been written. And there's a lot of interpretation, a lot of thinking that we've got to do. And the people of God in the church, we've got to engage with this issue and re-explore it. We'll just touch upon that at the end. But there are questions about why God made it this way. These poems affirm love, sex and marriage. They're good. But the poems warn that such intense emotion carries dangers with it. That's true to life. God made us to give each other pleasure. But that pleasure coming from sexual intimacy is integral to commitment one to the other. Then there is freedom. Then there is vulnerability. And if we detach the physical from all the rest, we lose out. Because sexual intimacy is integral to security one with the other. And that security is undermined. Why did God make us this way? Why is there this pattern? Because God knows that this way brings the maximum benefits for you and for me. Because this way gives sexual intimacy being integral to freedom. One of the great biblical words, freedom. And God wants to release us to our full humanity. You could summarize it that way. God is love. That means God's agenda is the best for us. That's why He sent Jesus. He entered our filth of humanity, becoming one of us, to break the power of all the evil that controls us, and to give us the potential to be set free through Jesus. But God wants the very best for us in every area of life, including sexual fulfilment when the committed bond of marriage. It's an expression of God's love for humanity. And God delights in our happiness and fulfillment. He made us sexual beings. We're different from the animals. For so often the male animal is driven by instinct, and the female animal accepts this by instinct, often not knowing what's actually happening. We're not like that. God has made us different. And there's physical pleasure in this. But we've got to keep the physical pleasure within a context of security and commitment. You see, the intimacy, security, freedom, the emotional bonding, all of these are so important for our security and our fulfillment as human beings. But they can be fulfilled with an exclusive commitment. If it's not exclusive commitment, then we miss out in some way. God just wants the best for us, and He's given us a picture in this book of the best. It involves utter vulnerability. In the Genesis words, they were naked and they were not ashamed. There was no embarrassment. There was total freedom and open to each other. And that comes within commitment. It's a beautiful and cohesive picture given to us in poetic form, showing from a woman's perspective mainly, but not entirely, something of this wonderful relationship. The book celebrates chastity. She says, I am a wall and my breasts are like towers. What she's saying here, and you can't allegorize that away. What she is saying here is, I am sexually mature, but I am not open to any man. She's committed to the one man. Thus I become in his eyes like one bringing contentment. She is totally devoted to one. Her decision, her choice, not imposed. That's the true meaning and wonder of this. Total commitment one to the other. She says, my own vineyard, that's my sexuality in the language of the day, is mine to give. And she contrasts it with Solomon, who sprayed his sexuality around the place with large numbers of wives and concubines. No, that's wrong. The contrast is painted. Devoted to one. The book celebrates responsibility. Love is as strong as death. The most powerful force in the society of the day, and perhaps still today. It's jealousy unyielding as the grave. There is a possessiveness from her towards him, from him towards her. Total commitment. The book celebrates pleasure, the pleasure that human beings can give to each other in the intimacy of sexual relationship. God made us that way. God delights in our pleasure. A book that celebrates commitment. I belong to my beloved, and his desire is for me. Two-way mutuality. Wonderful picture that the book gives to us in these poems. We've repeated this a few times. She is well aware. She knows how she can arouse her man in commitment. And she's giving this advice again and again to younger women. Be careful. Be careful. Don't arouse a man until you're in a position of commitment or to be committed. There's the summary. And in our society today, so much in our media presentations is built around young women, stimulating and stirring up men. We've got to be careful. Yes, men have responsibilities. Women have responsibilities. Now we have to remember, in the days when these poems were written, the culture was male orientated. Why marriages were largely arranged. The women didn't have the freedom of choice. And this poem certainly celebrates the freedom of choice. Perhaps countercultural and subversive in its day. But women entered marriage very young. We didn't have schools, we didn't have universities, we didn't have education. There were extended family groups, villages and communities. It's a different way of life and a different culture. And women would be married off as teenagers. And very often by the age of 20, 25, they would have 2 or 3 children. Our cultures today are different, but they've imposed greater stresses on young men and young women. I am not arguing for arranged marriages, but our societies today, with the extended periods of education and training, hold back the possibility of commitment and marriage. And it's tough on the young people today, because their natural sexuality wants fulfilment. And we, within the people of God, within the churches today, we've got to engage with these issues, address them, be honest about them, and not impose rules on our young people, but to give them a framework, a structure, and a support. Because it's tough today. Very tough. Great principles for us to think about in this set of poems. That's what modern day society does. It's become a kind of God, something that's more important than anything else, usually seen from the male perspective. And idolize anything or anyone besides God, where we seek the ultimate meaning and purpose of life. Sexual relationships may be wonderful, but they don't give the ultimate meaning and purpose of life. They cannot. But the tragedy is that historically and even today, we have shied away from this subject. We have not engaged with it. And we've left our young people without direction. Now, there are some glorious exceptions to this. But as a general principle, that is true. Sometimes we set up rules. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other. But we haven't really engaged with the issue with the young people. And there is a huge gulf between these perspectives. And what we're doing today is, within the people of God, we're hurling abuse at society and criticizing and condemning. And society hurls abuse back at the people of God, which very often ends up by saying we're all bigots. Oh, how we need this subject taken out and explored openly and freely. That isn't easy, but the Song of Songs gives us the framework. We've got to recognize that is simply true. And tragically, down through the history of mankind, that has always been true. Because it is the most intimate relationship, it's where Satan attacks, particularly brutally. Doesn't hold the answers, wonderful though it may be. And we've got a rose-tinted view of marriage. We've got to be honest and address these issues, explore them, look at them. And we've got to get back to that picture. So often everything is presented from the male perspective, and we've reduced sex to instinct. Mutuality, exclusivity, a total relationship, and simply something that's beautiful. We've got to get these pictures back into the frame, positively, affirmatively. And the Song of Songs can help us. But the tragedy is that this book is ignored. If you look at the Christian communities today, how many presentations, talks, sermons have you ever heard based on this book? Yes, odd verses have been ripped out of context, and often their meaning has been lost in the process. But that's not biblical interpretation. Right from the start, the people of God started to absorb ideas from Greek philosophy. And that led hundreds of years later to celibacy being regarded as wonderful and then imposed on all who wanted to be a priest. That's simply not biblical. Contradicts the very nature of humanity. And if we enforce and suppress a natural part of our human life, then the pressures will re-erupt in some other direction, and other people will get hurt, and we've seen evidence of that today. We must engage with the issue. So for a long time, people treated this book as an allegory. From about the 19th century onwards, scholars have realized it couldn't be treated this way. The language did not permit it. The structure and thought form didn't permit it. The way the New Testament doesn't quote it in the context of marriage and Christ and the church. Never refers to it. That's simply a wrong way. We lose out. We've ripped verses out of context and almost imposed any meaning we like on them. That's no way to treat any book. It contradicts the language. It contradicts the New Testament perspective. It is simply wrong. That's what it is. Let's get back, put that back in the frame, and see it as an aspect of God's wonderful creation. Not for everybody, yes, but for a large majority. It is an aspect of God's wonderful creation. Let's celebrate God's creation. That's what this book does. And it pictures us in a series of poems and gives us a framework and a structure to engage with the issue and to work it through into modern day society. That's the way the book was intended. All the evidence points to that. And now the vast majority of scholarship throughout the world sees it that way. The tragedy is that within certain parts of the Christian community, we're still taking it as an allegory. And that's abusing the text. It's not being honest. The church is people. Together. We've got to engage together with the central issues. Discussion, support, help, understanding the pressures on young people, teenagers in the cultures and societies of today. They are enormous. And things will go wrong from time to time, sadly. We must not condemn, but we must be there to stand with our young people, to support them, to help them through. There are positive messages. Boys and young men, girls and young women, but also the whole preparation for marriage, which is often left far too late. As often one meeting shortly before the marriage ceremony. Teenagers, because of all the media presentations and the social media, boys and young men are often driven by fantasy and powerful sexual drives. And the power of pornographic pictures is simply enormous, and their accessibility is so easy. The pressures on our young people today, particularly on boys and young men, are far, far greater than they were even a generation ago. We've got to stand with our young people. We've got to be aware of these realities, and we've got to be upfront, standing with them, supporting, teaching, giving them a biblical perspective, positively. But often teenage girls and young women are driven by unrealistic expectations of what they can expect from a man. And they discover their power to arouse, to stimulate. Now that power was given to girls and young women. It's God-given. But it's too tempting to use it and then to complain afterwards that when a young man is aroused, he loses control. These issues have got to be addressed. And again, our young girls and young women have got pressures placed upon them through the media and the social media that are far, far greater than the pressures of one generation ago. The people of God, the people of the church, we have got a huge responsibility. And looking at marriage, couple is driven by emotional love and desire. But there's an uncertainty and an excitement. And we have got to stand with and support our young people as couples come together, start to want to spend time together, to learn about each other, to touch each other, to share and do things together. No use waiting till just a few weeks before the marriage. We've got to stand with and support our young people on a big scale. We've got to give the boys and the young men an increased awareness about themselves and about the pressures of society. And we've got to teach them a growing respect for young women and girls. But equally, the other side, we've got to have an increased awareness for girls about the power they hold within themselves and their physical body, leading to sensible caution, and then come to marriage with a healthy dose of realism. There is a huge agenda for action. There are one or two publications on the market that are beginning to address these issues. But by and large, the church is just leaving them to the side. And we're losing out and letting our young people lose out. We've got to rethink biblical perspectives. And if our biblical perspectives are totally coloured by the idea that the greatest task in life is to remain celibate and be a priest, then we've distorted the thinking of young people. And there's a clear message from the actual example of the behaviour and the teaching of a church that pushes that kind of idea. Humans were made for relationships. Humans are made for sexuality and marriage. The vast majority will go into it. That's in no way suggesting that it's a second-class experience if it doesn't come your way. But we've got to get the biblical perspectives back. And we've got to be open and honest. We've got to recognise that in churches in the West we have a problem. The young women outnumber the young men dramatically. In fact, women outnumber men in churches, sometimes by about 2 to 1. The statistics are all there. We've got our church life wrong, and that gender balance has got to be restored, because there are many, many wonderful, wonderful young women in churches who look around and know they will never find a husband amongst the people of God, because there aren't enough young men. There may be no young men. And then they have a terrible battle to face. Do they marry someone who's not a follower of Jesus, with all the tensions that produces? Or do they remain single for the rest of life? This is our responsibility. We have created the problem, and the research shows how we can correct the gender problem. Let's implement it, address the issue. And enforcing celibacy is no answer. You can try to justify it away in all sorts of a way. We are contradicting the natural way God made human beings. Choosing celibacy is one thing. Enforcing it is another. We've got to get back and picture the nature of marriage and all the stresses of marriage in our modern day society when a couple are both working and there's young children, how to cope with child rearing, child care, education, the pressures and the terrible pressures on particularly a young mother, where she's faced with the fact that she's got the pressures of the workplace and the job, and yet she wants to give more time to her children, but the sheer exhaustion of the job makes it tough. And we've got to face up to contraception. It's no use saying it's wrong. It's there. You can't uninvent it. And it has enormous power to liberate. Because we are overpopulating the world. Or in some parts of it. In the West, it's the reverse. But it's also got a power to enslave. Because it means then that we can become slaves to sex anywhere, anytime, because there are no consequences. Apparently. We've got to face up to the fact that marriage is being entered later and later in the West, and that's placing stresses, inordinate, huge stresses that are impossible sometimes to cope with, on our young people. If you look at some Islamic states, where marriages are arranged, a girl can be married during her secondary school education. She's given the time off from school when she bears a child. And her education goes on until she's completed the number of years of education, not to a certain age. That's their way of looking at it. I'm not arguing for it. But we have got to address the issue within the Christian community. We have generated stresses. Education may be good and great, but we have generated stresses on natural human sexuality. And we've got to recognize that there is enormous power in money. Money is being poured into certain aspects of the media, including pornography. And the power of the social media and the twisted expectations that it can generate, where so often young people are made to feel failures because they're still a virgin. We've got to address these issues. We've got to support our young people in using media and social media and using them sensibly and critically. And we've got to address the support that young parents need. Within the Christian community, they need support from older adults, where they're struggling to raise children, cook meals for them in the evening, having done a long day's work. That is part of life today. And oh, there are many, many older people in churches who could give so massively if there was an atmosphere of trust and sharing. And I've seen examples of this, where students have managed to fit in a few hours or maybe a day looking after the children where both parents are working. They're all within the same church community. There's a deep bond of trust. And both are helped. We've got to set up structures to support our young people and our young parents. This set of poems is a celebration of sexual love. But it's also a celebration of commitment. Read the poems. Her commitment for him and his commitment to her is absolute. It's a celebration of pleasure. We just tend to pass that over. It's the way God made us. He rejoices in our pleasure. and it's a celebration of realism. Oh, there's great messages in this book that we've got to take on board and address the issues in the culture and context of our modern day societies. The Song of Songs, a remarkable book.